Hola, welcome to Latinx and GIS SIG. My name is Maria Patino, my pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm an operations analyst at Esri. I am also the founder and one of the leaders of Claro. I will be moderating the session along with my colleague Juan Carlos.
Hello, everybody. My name is Juan Carlos Tarazona. My pronouns are he, him, él, and I'm a solution architect for Esri. Welcome, everybody.
We are very excited to be here today. This is the first time that during the Esri User Conference, Latinx SIG is hosted. And in addition to that, we have an amazing lineup of speakers. Dr. Theresa Williamson from Catalytic Communities, who is tuning in all the way from Brazil. Dr. Elana, the Director of Racial Equity Anchor Collaborative at Unidos US, and Zarith Pineda from Territorial Empathy, both of them who are tuning in from New York. During this session, you will hear the amazing work and initiatives that the presenters are leading, and they're focused on addressing and bringing awareness to the structural and racial inequities that are affecting our communities. So since this is the first time that we host a SIG, we want to share a little bit about Claro. Claro is a community group for Latinx people and allies with a mission to empower the Latinx community by leveraging geography and GIS to achieve equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we do this in a number of ways. We focus on cultivating spaces that reinforce our connections through our languages, our diverse cultures, and the rich history that unites us all, raising awareness about issues that are affecting our communities, raising GIS and tech career awareness as we want to increase representation, and collaborating with partners and NGOs and other allies like we're doing today. We want to connect and collaborate with all of you, so we invite all of you to be a part of Claro. Without further ado, I will pass it on to Dr. Theresa Williamson to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this amazing opportunity. I want to thank the Esri User Conference, and I want to thank Claro especially for this invitation. My name is Theresa Williamson. I'm talking to you from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm a city planner, and 21 years ago, I founded a nonprofit here called Catalytic Communities that offers all sorts of strategic support to grassroots organizers in the favela communities of Rio. Basically, we work with local organizers in favelas, which are informal settlements here in Brazil, who are doing amazing work on the ground to help strengthen their work. And we do this in the context, again, of Rio, which is a city that's incredibly divided. Any of you who have been here know this. The city is famous for its inequality, unfortunately. And the favelas are actually located across the city. You can see them here in reds and oranges. We have over 1,000 favela communities. They're located across the urban fabric, whether it's in the South Zone, you can see here in the next image, also in the North Zone of the city, you can see in the next image. They really are located everywhere. They also are marked by the racial legacy of Brazil and its colonial past. Brazil had 60% longer period of slavery than the US. We received 10 times the number of enslaved Africans as the entire United States. And almost half of those came through the port of Rio. So this port of Rio received 5 times the number of enslaved Africans as the entire United States. And this history actually marks everything about the city, even though it's rarely talked about. And you can see it in the racial makeup of the city, in the favelas. But when you visit these communities, you also see that actually, despite the history of how they were started, hold on, if you could slow down just a second. Despite the history of how they began, they've been able to develop quite a lot over 120 years. This is the very first favela of Providencia today. Go ahead. And residents have been able to develop on their own, sometimes with government investment, but mostly their own infrastructure. Go ahead. These communities are marked by a lot of personal investment by families, but horribly inadequate public investment. Go ahead. And Rio's favelas, like in a lot of Latin America, are quite established, which is different from other parts of the world, like in Africa and Asia, where informal settlements are newer because urbanization is a younger process there. So you can see here diversity of images, of different circumstances, different qualities as well as challenges in these communities, but every single image is unique. And because these are informal communities and they're not regulated, they really are unique. And even from one week to another, you get a different experience in these communities. And I'm not going to get into this today, but overall, people in favelas don't want to leave their communities. They want to stay in those communities because, again, in the case of Rio, these are generations old communities. So it's in the context of these very complex neighborhoods that Catalytic Communities was founded in 2000. Our first 10 years were focused on providing spaces online and in person for grassroots organizers to meet, share strategies, knowledge, training. Go ahead. And then in 2010, we started working heavily in communications because of the Olympic buildup, and then the buildup to the 2016 Rio Olympics. We had a lot of evictions. And so the communities we had been working with, even more consolidated, more functional favelas with fewer challenges, were being targeted with eviction because of the broad generalizations that people have about these communities. So we did a lot of work in communications those years. Go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. And then, sorry, I have included this slide here just not to go into it in a lot of detail, but just to let everyone know that we as an organization practice what's called asset-based community development, which is the polar opposite of typical development, not only international development, but also how governments often treat low-income communities everywhere, where they think of them as sort of deficient places with problems, where you have to go in and do charity. Instead, we look at these communities from their assets, which are tremendous. We identify opportunities, we build strategies based on those opportunities, and we recognize that residents are deserving of investment and rights. Go ahead. So all of our projects come out of that understanding, and we sort of see the organization as having a life cycle. I showed you the networking phase in the beginning, the communications phase, we're in the model development phase. Go ahead. And if you saw this sort of on a map, on a sort of longitudinal chart, you kind of see it as this slide shows. Oops, that's fine. We can skip over that. So today we have 4 programs, and this is where I'm going to get into why we're here at the Esri conference. We have 4 programs. We focus on community reporting and narrative shifting, the Sustainable Favela Network, which is a network of community organizations working to improve their outcomes and make their community sustainable, the Favela Community Land Trust around land rights, and finally, the focus of the presentation today, our COVID-19 in Favelas Unified Dashboard, which is basically a crowdsourced platform for favela communities to share data on COVID-19. Go ahead. It came obviously out of the pandemic. The circumstances here in Rio are dire. I think many of you are following or have followed the significance of our political context here in Brazil these days. We have, just over 200 million people. Oh, sorry, before I talk about that, this is the last image of our last face-to-face event before the pandemic started. It was an annual meetup of the Sustainable Favela Network. And it was actually when this network went onto online meetings on Zoom that we started hearing about all the COVID cases happening in the communities that many of these grassroots leaders live in, and realizing that they weren't being reported by the mainstream media, that the government wasn't collecting data, and so on. So we can switch to the next slide now. And that's what led us to launch the COVID-19 in Favelas Unified Dashboard. We went onto the online platforms with our community meetings, and we had to have these sort of rounds of solidarity, listening to residents and leaders talk about the cases in their communities. Please hold on to this slide. It's fine, yeah, you can go to the next one. I'll be talking all about the dashboard. So this next slide, I'll just share a little bit of the context again. Brazil is just over 200 million people, yet we are fast on track to beat the US as the country with the most COVID deaths. We're now at 537,000. The US is just over 600,000. And we have the highest case, death count daily, higher than India at the moment. So we're in a very dire situation here. Favelas are really, among other low-income communities in Brazil, are among sort of the the most critical areas, right? Where the conditions are there that have been leading to these high numbers. So all these pre-existing conditions listed on the left: public sector neglect, limited resources, people, residents not being able to forgo work, they don't have enough support, precarious access to medical care, insufficient water access, recurring hardships, dense living conditions, even things that would be positive in favelas in normal times, like intergenerational living and mutual support across generations would normally be a good thing. But in the moment of COVID, this creates a huge problem when young people and elderly are living under the same roof and the parents have to go out to work. At the same time, for example, the high social nature, pedestrian orientation of favela communities. So on the right-hand side, you see the additional compounding factors in today's Brazil. So we're talking about leadership that's trivialized the pandemic. There's currently a major investigation into corruption, in fact, around the pandemic. We had insufficient and tardy economic support to people. Testing, and this is where we get into why the dashboard was so critical. Testing has been grossly insufficient. People, even with symptoms, were being told to wait 2 weeks to get tested, and so they wouldn't go back. Some would pass away. So we know that there was a significant undercount. Go ahead. And this is what led us, after, again, in our community meetings online, realizing that there were all these cases, they weren't being tested, they weren't being recognized, realizing we needed to do something about it. There were already a number of community organizations doing data collection around COVID, because favela communities are incredibly versatile in their civil society. There's just about everything you can think of happening at the grassroots here. And there were groups collecting data. So we basically brought everyone together. And I wanted to do a special call out to Calvin Juan, who from Esri, who dedicated over a month to helping us set this platform up. It has been a critical resource here in Rio, as I'll show. So go ahead. So the activities that the dashboard conducts, we do data collection, expansion, and updates. I'll talk a little bit about each of these. Emotional check-ins and planning sessions. So basically getting together with, regularly to hear how things are going in people's communities. Press conferences and ongoing media, informational campaigns, and I'll talk about a couple specific campaigns: Data Saves Lives and our vaccination campaign, and then tailoring. And then we're also doing data analysis and methodology analysis and publishing those as well for others to learn from. Go ahead. So in terms of the first of those, which is obviously the heart of this initiative, data collection and mapping. So when we realized, as I said, favelas are particularly at risk to COVID. We knew that from the beginning of the pandemic. Government didn't do anything special despite knowing this, not at the local, state, or federal levels. They sort of left favelas to their own devices like they have historically. Residents organized to do whatever they could, education campaigns, food distribution, hygiene products, and it was pretty impressive. But they also organized around data gathering. Please hold on to the slide for a second. So you see here examples of communities where they're collecting data face-to-face with residents, but also there were community groups who would go to the local clinic to collect data from the local clinic. There were community groups that would use surveys online or WhatsApp. And so that's how the dashboard began. We basically collected data from these organizations that already were doing this kind of work on the ground. Go ahead. But then over time, you can go ahead, yeah. So over time, we were able also to do something that the city could have done very easily. Basically, the argument that municipal officials would give is, oh, we can't do it, we can't collect data by favelas because they don't have zip codes. And all the data were being gathered by zip code. But actually what we did was we worked with a partner at the Brazilian National Health Foundation, Fiocruz, who was able to identify estimated zip codes for the favelas. So we've been week after week, basically accessing more and more favelas. And then this map here is an initiative called COVID by Zip Code. It's a volunteer-run initiative as well. And so we connected with them and we send them the zip codes for the favelas that we've identified, and they send us the data. And so over time, go ahead, we've been able to update the dashboard and add data points. So you can see sort of the growth here over each of the press conferences we've had over the last year plus. of the dashboard, just showing the growth. Some of the growth is obviously we have more and more favelas that we've been able to get data for, and some of the growth is simply obviously the fatalities and the cases that we're documenting. So over this period, as the dashboard, oh, if you could just go back one. Over this period, as the dashboard shows, we've got 77,000 cases confirmed and nearly 6,000 deaths. This is just in 68% of favela, covering about 68% of favela households. That's how many we've been able to cover so far in the city of Rio. There are about 1.4 million people living in favelas in Rio. This number of deaths is more than 166 countries, entire countries have experienced. And that's just in the favelas of Rio. Go ahead. And so actually equally important, to be totally honest, to the data have been the weekly emotional check-ins and planning sessions that we have with the community organizers on the ground. These are moments where we basically decide what we're doing next with the dashboard, what kind of visibility communities need, what are the issues that are happening now. This is where we identified right away when there were issues with testing access, because people were relaying these cases across favelas, across the city. We were hearing, we heard when hunger started striking in a major way, we heard it here first. So this is a moment for us to help each other, lend support, come up with strategies. We also have some public health experts in these calls that helps clarify things, and local leaders can then take that information back into their communities. So these have been really critical as well. Go ahead. We're going to finish up. I know the time is running out. So these are examples of some of the organizers on the front lines of COVID. Go ahead, in these communities that are part of the dashboard project. This is the work they're doing during the day and trying to prevent and support their residents through the crisis. Go ahead. And we've run a couple of campaigns, one around data, importance of data. You guys can check out the video later if you like. It was a social media campaign, Data Save Lives. Go ahead. And then we also had a campaign around vaccine access in favelas, which was sent to all the public officials here in Rio, trying to promote why the favelas should be on the priority access list. Go ahead. And then finally, we've again worked a lot with the press. We've had 4 press conferences. It's produced at least 50 major articles, but probably well over 100 others, and some of these obviously were syndicated, so they reached larger audiences as well. Go ahead. They're also, over time, the media were using our platform as a direct source. So that's it for now. I think there's one more slide, just I'm cognizant of time, so I'll just let you all know that we have plans in the future. We're not just stopping with what we do when the pandemic is over. We're actually going to use the infrastructure that's been built to continue collecting data on other things that come up, not just COVID-19. And we plan to cover 90% of favelas. That's our hope by the end of the project. There's a lot more potential in this, so please do reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Theresa. Now we will pass it on to Dr. Elana Needle.
Hey, everybody, and that was a great presentation. Thank you so much, Theresa. My name is Elana Needle, and I'm the director of what's called the Racial Equity Anchor Collaborative at Unidos US. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see all of the groups that are in our collaborative. And we are generously supported by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And as you can see, we are incorporated of the Advancement Project National Office, Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum, DEMOS, Faith in Action, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, National Congress of American Indians, National Urban League, Race Forward, and Unidos. And together, our mission is to promote racial equity, advance racial healing, and ensure that all children, families, and communities have opportunities to reach their full potential. If you could go to the next slide, please. And together, we created our census campaign for the 2020 decennial census in America. It's called our campaign was the My Family Counts campaign. And this is the data hub that we set up. And just to give you a bit of background, this decennial census, you can stay on this slide, thanks. The decennial census in the US is a constitutionally mandated count of the entire US population conducted every 10 years. The census counts are used ubiquitously for the next 10 years to do everything from distribute upwards of $600 billion of federal appropriations and funding annually that flows to the states, and that does not include funding dispersals tied to COVID relief, which also utilize census counts, to cutting both federal congressional voting districts and therefore dictating the number of congressional representatives a state has based on population counts, to cutting state and local voting districts, to private sector usages such as citing new business locations, also to understanding things like segregation, integration, and housing needs. There's traditionally an undercount in communities of color anywhere between 2 to 10 percentage points, particularly in our communities, which are Black or African American, Latino or Latinx, Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, and American Indian Alaska Native. There's an undercount of children of color between the ages of 0 to 5 to upwards of 5%. For some reason, people forget that children are part of their family and they don't include them in census counts. So we decided to resource our local chapters, partners, and affiliates to participate in the census to ensure a full and robust count of communities of color. Our interventions are multiracial, so we brought together members of different communities to speak about how the census impacted their community, and we were even able to pivot to virtual using self-recorded PSAs, etc. We funded Get Out the Count efforts in communities both in Florida and Michigan, and you can go to the next slide, and created this hub for our organizations to see linkages, areas of growth, and we also coupled data streams in a different way to create what we called HTC, or hard to count location maps. We additionally used those hard to count location maps and we created an affiliate infrastructure. So we mapped all of the organizations reach within our intervention states, which were Florida and Michigan. And then we're able to see areas where we had good coverage or areas where maybe we didn't have enough coverage and needed to resource our investment more. And our hard to count location maps and affiliate maps were able to drill down to the census block level, also to the county level. And then we were able to layer in self-response data, as you can see on the last thing on this slide. As responses were coming in and opened up, we were able to then layer that in and understand, in addition to where the hard to count communities were, where the current undercounted communities were. Next slide, please. And then we were able to build ourselves dashboards to understand what the undercounts look like in both Florida and Michigan and use that undercount for geo-targeting our ad buys. So we had radio, digital, social media. We also had PSAs in English and Spanish, encouraging folks to complete the census, explaining what the census was. And we also were able to use that mapping for our 2020 election cycle ad buys as well. So the data, it was dual purposes. And the 2020 census was unlike any other before it, and it will likely be different than any other forthcoming decennial census. It was the first census conducted online. You could also respond by phone, which was new, and you could use the traditional paper form. But even before the pandemic hit during the self-response window, there was chronic federal and state predominantly Republican controlled states that had huge underfunding and climate of fear in responding due to the ill-fated attempts by the Trump administration to add a citizenship question for the first time in 70 years to the census. The debate, messaging, and court cases on the addition of the question led to a presumed undercount in the Latino community and other immigrant communities. The only counts we have so far from the Census Bureau are apportionment numbers. And those numbers are what we use to cut the congressional districts for our House of Representatives. And what we're seeing is that states where we know there's fast growing Latino populations actually lost congressional representatives: Arizona, Florida, and Texas. And they each lost a seat when they were predicted to gain a seat, meaning that Latino communities in those states lost political power on the federal level and will likely have very gerrymandered voting districts for state and municipal elections. And then if you switch to the next slide, we also decided to pivot to a partnership with Esri, unpacking police budgets and really understanding, given the ongoing cries by civil society in America for police reform to understand how much police and law enforcement jurisdictions are actually, how much they are resourced compared to things like public schools and mental health or substance abuse recovery, just for example. So this project is still in its infancy, but we are going to, we have a community dashboard and a survey, which you'll see. And if you can go to the next slide, please. We are zeroing in on 370 jurisdictions that meet inclusion methodology. Some of the factors are a high a high percentage of people of color in that community. They are near a high profile police encounter, which is one that got a lot of press, that occurred in a, usually in a death or some morbidity or mortality. They are also near a Black Lives Matter protest or a big protest that happened. And we are in the process now of reaching out to these jurisdictions to ask them to complete a budget survey. But we also would love for citizens on the ground, interested advocates, to encourage their jurisdictions to complete the survey as well. You can go to the next slide, please. And included in our website, we have, which is all built on ArcGIS Hub, we also have story maps that talk you through and explain how we got to where we are, even in envisioning a project on policing, reimagining policing, and then how we got to the jurisdictions that we would like to prioritize to find out what their budgets look like. We also have included some of Esri's amazing resources, like we included different apps and maps that you can access that can help you unpack racial equity using GIS. And then if you go to the next slide, please. We created, as I said, a number of maps to really understand. On the left is the ubiquitousness of law enforcement jurisdictions. So there are around 24,000 law enforcement jurisdictions all over America. And some are small community-based offices, and some are regional or state. And so there is, and when you drill down on this map where those big circles are, when you see just how many law enforcement jurisdictions are in a small area, it will shock you. And obviously it is not, we do not have enough resources to survey 24,000 jurisdictions. And then you can also see the community makeup in those communities. So where there are more jurisdictions, there tend to be more people of color. And this is how America responds. So it's just good to understand the maps. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And we also are layering in things like learn lessons, which will teach users how to use GIS for racial equity. And we will include learn lessons that are related to policing in some way. So there are some that look like that analyze and assess unsolved murder rates and the disparity between neighborhoods where there are communities where there are 50%, upwards of 50% of unsolved murders tend to be Black and brown communities in America. We've also looped in Esri's amazing police transparency solution, so organizations and folks can see that as well. And we've had ongoing events, which we highlight here. And we also, I believe that's the last slide, but if there isn't, we also will like to include resources here. And with that, I would like to kick it over to my colleague, Zarith and Dara. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Thank you to my co-presenters for those phenomenal and exciting presentations. And so today I'll be talking to you about territorial empathy, which is my practice. I am an architect by training and urbanist. And through my work in architecture originally, I realized that to really get to the issues, for people to even get to the building, there's so many questions that need to be answered. And this understanding led me to study urbicide, which is the destruction of a built environment. My thesis work is on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I've worked in different places around the world, ultimately ending up in New York, where I realized that in a community that's supposed to be so progressive with their community engagement initiatives, I was witnessing a lot of performative allyship. And I really thought that if the firms where I was working were supposed to be at the cutting edge, and that was the best that communities of color were getting, then we were doing really bad. And so I funded Territorial Empathy, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And we really, our main idea, our big idea is that we have to create empathy in our communities, and we have to bring design thinking, we have to bring GIS technology and all of the tools that are usually kind of kept out from our communities into those communities to help them tell their stories. There's no better expert in their community than folks that live in them. And so the project that really kicked Territorial Empathy off, and again, I will have a trigger warning, it deals with the sexual assault of migrant children. So we're thinking about Claro and Latinidad, and migration is one of the things that I'm so worried about. I'll be talking on a panel about the relationship between migration and climate change after this, but you know, immigration is so complex, but immigrants and people of color, particularly Latinos, have been so stigmatized. And we had this terrible previous administration who started separating children from their parents. And so when I started doing work on this, I couldn't figure out that not enough people were talking about the silent epidemic that is too gruesome for people to talk openly about, but it's the epidemic of sexual assault that these children are facing at the hands of the people that are supposed to take care of them. And so at the time, this representative from Florida, Ted Deutsch, started a FOIL request to get information regarding these cases from the Trump administration, and what he received is this pixelated document that's on the left. And that document is it was part of the practice of the previous administration to slow information down. And so essentially when there were these requests, they would get some congressional or White House intern to scan documents over and over again to make them difficult for text recognition. And so what we did at the beginning of Territorial Empathy was to really take this seriously and try to digitize these cases so we could show the magnitude of what was happening to these kids. And that's exactly what we did. And so the dashboard is on our website, territorialempathy.com, and the project is called Unaccompanied Assault. And we visualized all of the reports that were in this DOJ report, and we not only visualize them and map them, as you can see on the right, you can see the care centers, you can see some of the descriptions of the reports, but we also try to paint a more comprehensive picture, which is where these kids are coming from, their ages, if the cases were investigated, if who was a perpetrator that was signaled out. And this really was done to give a little bit of a different context and to show that there's so many fallacies with this terrible policy. And so it's been used to advocate for this little known topic by Representative Ted Deutsch and other advocates, and it's in Spanish and English. A lot of the work we do really is based on access and equity, so it's very important for us to always have materials translated. The next project that I'll talk about is somewhat related, Going North. Going North, I won't get too into, but I think to me, all of these issues are related, right? Why are people coming and risking their lives and their children's lives on such a dangerous, perilous journey? And so that is so tied to climate change and climate resiliency. The bulk of the migration northward comes from the Northern Triangle region, which we can see on the left-hand side. That is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, unlike the popular narrative that it's just folks from Mexico. It actually is not. And net migration from Mexico has been declining steadily over the last decade. So we essentially wanted to show the correlations between drought and climate change in this zone and Border Patrol apprehensions, and that's what Going North does. We created this for the World Bank in partnership with the World Data Visualization Society. And so what we were able to show is looked at satellite imagery, we looked at drought and vegetation, and we're able to map patterns of drought over the last 10 years. And so for countries that are 95% agriculture is subsistent, for them to not be able to grow crops already puts a perilous situation under more pressure. And so how do we not expect these folks that are the least carbon emitting in the Americas, but have to pay the most consequences, not want to, make decisions for their families that are so difficult? And so I encourage you all to see it. And then you can actually see on the American side, a correlation with Border Patrol apprehensions. And you can see correlations between rainfall and the peak migration and apprehensions. So it's really an extension of what my colleagues have talked about and how we respond with incarceration to different types of issues that really need to be dealt and thought about differently. And so moving on. This is where I'll spend the bulk of our time. Segregation is Killing Us as a project that was born at the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of the work that I've done, particularly in New York City, has been around the segregation of public schools. And so as I'm talking, this image will be running in the background. It's looking into the dashboard, but most folks don't know that New York City has the most racially segregated public schools in the United States. It's something that I've been working on for the last number of years through a coalition for racially just schools. There's over 50 different organizations and activists who are working against this. It's unconscionable that in the most diverse and wealthy city in the world, we have such segregation. So through this work, I was very aware of the fact that 77% of New York City public school students rely on their school communities for food. And so right before the pandemic happened and closures happened, I was on a committee that was looking at essentially how COVID was going to affect school communities. And I realized that the Department of Education was really out of their depth and very quickly knew that within 2 weeks, almost 800,000 students would be food insecure. And at the time, I'm sure many of you have heard our governor has been accused of some transparency issues when it comes to reporting coronavirus information, and that was also the case with what was happening. So we decided to start mapping how COVID spread through New York City, and we started visualizing the cases, as you can see, by income and by race. And we also worked with a telecom subsidiary who donated data to us, cell phone level data, that allowed us to show how essentially folks moved as the quarantine started happening. And so we realized that actually it was wealthier, mostly white folks from New York City that were going to their second and third homes, who were very responsible for the spread of COVID throughout the United States. And so in the next slide, I believe in the GIF, you'll get a glimpse of that. Maria, if we could move over to the next slide. Yeah, so go back. The GIF, yeah. Or do we not have the GIF anymore? That's fine. I encourage you all to go into Segregation is Killing Us. This is only showing half of the platform. Territorialempathy.com/segregation is killing us. But essentially, we were able to show regionally and nationally that it's this new wave of colonialism of privileged folks who really were responsible for spreading COVID around our country. And so what we decided to do with this information was bring it to the DOE and really use this to advocate for integrating schools in a different and meaningful way. So we were already cognizant that children of color were under all these terrible circumstances already. And so, and that they were being disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Our research found that if you're a person of color in New York City, you're 2 times more likely to contract COVID, 3 times more likely to die. So we essentially had to make a case to why it was more important than ever to give under-resourced families resources. And so we started mapping all of these different concerns, right? some of the concerns we mapped. And by the way, this was done in community with Integrate NYC, brilliant organization in New York that I encourage you all to check out. Really phenomenal work. So all of the videos and all of the information that you see are narrated by youth activists. So I encourage you all to look at them. And they were the ones that were reporting what was happening in their communities. And so what they wanted to investigate relating to COVID, so we looked at childhood accessibility to Wi-Fi or the different remote learning tools that folks need to get online and successfully do school, linguistic isolation, all of these different factors, air quality, pollution, factors that are so important in understanding how COVID really impacts communities of color. We also looked at undocumented folks. We looked at the workforce, essential workers, and essentially finding out that it was people of color who kept the lights on in New York. They were the essential workers. We looked at the makeup and really realized that our people really didn't get a chance to come out of this unscathed, and that everything was essentially set up for them to fail. And so what we did with Segregation is Killing Us was propose a new metric that we're in the process of lobbying the Department of Education to use in the admissions process next school year, next school cycle, which essentially gives a priority to the children that come from these communities. So we created a combined impact score from all of these metrics that the students identified, and at the census tract level. And so we're giving a community priority, a community impact score that we're feeding into the admissions process to kind of even out some of these disparities that have happened. And so, as I mentioned, if we can go to the next slide, I'm also an architect, and so part of this work is also going off, the dashboard and going offline and really seeing how we can bring it to communities. And data literacy is something that I'm really passionate about. Not everyone can read a map successfully. Not everyone can read, period. And so part of this work is that we're taking Segregation is Killing Us on the road this summer in New York City starting August 20th. If you're around, you'll be hearing about this, and I encourage you to attend. It's free. We're doing this in partnership with New York Civic Engagement Commission, and we're essentially taking this on this LED screen that you can see up there. And it's going to be hosted on the People's Bus, which is a project that we're also designing at Territorial Empathy that is taking a corrections vehicle that you can see on the left-hand side from the, actually, if we could just stay on there. It's a really dark and depressing space that this bus was used to bring prisoners to Rikers Island. And so we're turning that into community space for healing and joy, to help teach folks about these systemic injustices, but also bring really, really great resources and joy to our community. So if we go to the next slide, we'll be able to kind of see the festival. These are some draft renders. You guys are the first people to see this. We actually haven't even published this. It's a little bit of a secret. So we're having inflatables. We're having all of these different elements to create public spaces that are really meaningful. And so we're also, Segregation is Killing Us is really determining through our research of the communities hardest hit by COVID, it's determining where we're taking the bus. So it's kind of how the spatial and GIS thinking and spatial approach is actually, now informing this programming, these events, and the follow-up, right? So we've created this, and then we're also bringing vaccination trucks to these areas, participatory budgeting, and all these different tools to make sure that folks that went through this trauma can have a little bit of respite and joy. And so with that, I'm done. It was such a pleasure to be here. I hope that you can join us if you're in New York for the People's Bus Tour. Again, August 20th to September 4th, we're going to every borough, and I encourage you to look out for work at territorialempathy.com and at Territorial Empathy on social media. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zarith, Elana, and Theresa. Now we will be going into the Q&A, and I do want to make a mention that Zarith will only be joining us for the first 5 minutes of the Q&A, as she will need to join another session. So Juan Carlos, if you can help us reading some of the questions that have been coming in and perhaps begin with Zarith, that would be great.
Yes, sure, Maria. So, Zarith, what have been some of your motivators for doing this work? If you can talk to us about it a little bit.
That's a great question. I think I'm motivated by just by the joy that our people have, you know, especially as being a Latino immigrant in the United States. There's so much joy, there's so much beauty in our communities, but we're often so underestimated. And I think another thing that is super important is that we have all of these, like, we're kind of swimming against the current, and our communities don't realize that. So because of colonialism or colorism, we internalize a lot of these systemic issues, and we think it's our fault, and it actually, the system is kind of set up for us to fail. So I think there's so much empowerment when you show people information about redlining, information about all these disparities, to say that it's not that you're just making this up and how you feel is totally justified, because, you know, we essentially have to deal with things that other folks don't have to deal with. And so that is so empowering for folks to learn about. So that's definitely a big motivator.
Great, thanks. Maybe in the same area, what piece of advice can you give individuals or organizations looking to start similar projects? Let's say, for example, segregation is killing us. That, you know, address social and racial inequities. What piece of advice would you offer?
I think it's really important. Before, I think, you know, this is the Esri user conference, and I'm such a big proponent of GIS, but I think before we even sit down and map, I think sometimes it's really important to think about how we tell a story and who we're telling this story to and who's going to benefit from that story. And I think that starts giving us different answers, right, about how the information is presented. For example, you know, some of our maps aren't, you know, there's some maps that you can zoom in and out, but some are animations that are talking you through information. And those are very deliberate choices. And so once it's really figuring out how that's, you know, what is the story you're trying to tell? And then that really allows you to think about how you go about telling it. And so it really, sometimes it might be mapping, sometimes it might be data viz, but it also allows you to bring in the stakeholders that make sense. So once that concept question is really clear, everything else starts falling into place. Segregation is Killing Us started literally in the middle of quarantine. It was me and a friend who's a data scientist, and then it grew just by asking questions and asking folks and bringing light to these issues into a project that we ended up doing with this advocacy organization. And it really blew up. By the time we were done, I think there were almost 25 people working on the project, totally pro bono volunteer work, and now it's being used by the Department of Education to dictate policy. So I think as long as you have a really great question and you're not afraid to ask for help and get people on board, and you can tell a concise story, it all starts falling into place.
Great. Maria, is there any other question for Zarith?
Yeah, we can start with the next question, and perhaps Zarith, if you want to begin answering that, and then we can let the rest of the presenters answer it as well, because it's a really good question. How can we account for those who do not have access to technology or the internet? How do we ensure to reach those who are technology marginalized, such as disconnected youth and families, and those who have been displaced? So Zarith, since you have so many initiatives, how do you do your outreach? And then perhaps we can go with Theresa and Elana as well.
That's a great question. And I think it's something we struggle with because, you know, there's some folks that you can't really send a survey to. It's happened a lot in my organizing work. Literacy is a huge deal, especially in Brooklyn. We've worked with a lot of Latinx communities where people don't know how to read and write. So then how do you expect them to answer a survey? So it actually is a lot of in-person engagement, and it's made very difficult by the pandemic. And so it really is about sitting down and having conversations with folks. That's why I feel so strongly about the People's Bus, and we're taking it to where we're taking it. And really, I think it's about creating a chain of impact. So I work with a lot of young people. There's 30 youth fellows that are staffing the event that are being paid for by the Civic Engagement Commission. And my job is to essentially make sure that they understand this information in the simplest way so then they can tell it to other people. And what's really great about working with young people as kind of as a practice is that they really just are so smart, but they're so clear in communicating, and they also get bored, right? So if you can't get them excited, then you're not going to get a passerby excited. And so if they're excited, they're going to kind of do that work for you. And so it's really about kind of passing on the baton and then just getting into community, having conversations. Sometimes that's holding a clipboard and doing surveys literally on a sidewalk, as I've done many times, or it's not necessarily quantitative data, but it's qualitative data, and there's some really great conversations that can lead the research in a different way. So with that, I'll pass it to my colleagues, and I got to run to the next session, but it's really been an honor to have been invited by such a brilliant initiative, and it's been a pleasure to be here with you all today.
Thank you, Zarith. Elana or Theresa, if you're there, I can repeat the question if needed.
I'm happy to reply. Yeah,
Sure.
Great. Actually, it's interesting, both of these questions and another one that I think was passed on to me earlier about how the Latin American community living in the US could contribute to development. I would answer all three in sort of the same way, which is basically identifying grassroots or community-based organizations that have that capillarity, that have that local knowledge. They know what needs to be done. They know what the assets are, the qualities are, they know how to handle them. And often those are sort of the most impactful for the money organizations out there. Often they're mostly volunteer, but they do incredible things because people live in the community, they're dedicated to it, regardless of resources. But then when you can give them resources on top of that, incredible things can happen. And those resources could be financial, but it could also be your GIS skills. So I'm just thinking here, pretty much every community-based organization here in Rio, if somebody who was expert in GIS got in touch and said, could you do anything with these skills? They probably could come up with some really interesting things. So the question is more that maybe people aren't thinking about those things because they can't imagine having somebody with that expertise. And then the question about access, how do you account for those without access to technology? It's like with the COVID dashboard here in Rio, we had local grassroots organizers pretty much always have the internet at a sometimes better quality, sometimes lower quality, but always have access to the internet by virtue of the needs that they have to realize their community work. But many of the people they serve don't. But if you're working with those grassroots organizers who are, again, working against all odds to improve their communities, you can get so much done, and you can also support those who don't have access, learn about them, find out how to support them. So there are organizations like ours that do that connection directly to grassroots initiatives here in Rio, but I'm sure there are in other cities. So depending on where you're interested in, I really think it's worthwhile to identify an organization that you can support, whether it's financially or through your skills or your connections, and that you can just get close to and learn what their needs are. They're the ones who know what the needs are in their communities, and then see how you can provide support that addresses those needs.
Thank you, Theresa. Let me see if we can have another question. So here we have, how can someone get into work that empowers a community when you don't see a job posting that says that they're hiring for GIS specifically? Elana, would you like to start off maybe with that one?
Sure. There are loads of ways to get involved in your community when you don't see a posting that has GIS specifically. Getting involved in your community doesn't mean you have to do it through GIS. You can do it through many avenues, but if you want to use GIS, then you can use in your new position, for example, or a new job, you can actually advocate for the use and utilization of GIS when you get there and understand and explain the nuance and wonderful ways that geospatial technology can actually help you comprehend both the organization and its impact, but also the community that you're embedded in. But I would say if you're really interested in empowering your community, then you can do it in any way that feels important to you. And that can be through community action. It can be through fundraising for an organization like Theresa's or Zarith, and that are doing local on the ground work, and that are embedded and aligned with your values and ethos. So I would say that I wouldn't relegate your desire to be active to your specific employment if your employment isn't answering that question for you. And that's okay. There are ways that you can get involved in every aspect of your life.
Juan Carlos, do we have time perhaps for one more question? Sorry.
Yeah, I think we do. So there were quite a few questions for Theresa and Elana. Let's go with one about what have been some of the setbacks working during the pandemic when collecting data, and what will you do in the future to make sure things like that maybe don't interfere with your work, or if you can comment around that, maybe Theresa, what the work that you have done in the favelas.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we weren't doing data collection at all before. Our work, like I said, we did communications work, we did community organizing work, and land rights. So this is the first experience we've had. So the setbacks, I can't compare with pre-pandemic in terms of data gathering. The pandemic itself was a huge setback for our work and for any development, obviously, pretty much anywhere in the world. And so I guess, I don't know if there's much I can add. I mean, I can say about, I mean, what we've learned to be honest, we've built on what we knew already, which is something we learned from favela communities and in our work over the years, which is to be responsive and flexible and agile. Because when the pandemic hit, like I said, we didn't say, oh, let's wait and see what's going to happen. No, we said we're meeting, all our face-to-face meetings are moving online immediately. What are the needs now? How have they changed? And what do we do now? So we pivoted very quickly. We made a decision immediately to not do face-to-face till the end of the year. And we just set in motion a new plan, which is very much in line with how communities here organize as well, very responsive. So I guess it's more learning, building on previous knowledge is what we've done during the pandemic.
Yeah, Elana, how about in your case?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like everybody else, and as Theresa noted, everything was impacted by the pandemic, and we were in the middle of obviously running our census campaign and also ramping up for the 2020 election cycle. And as Theresa noted, we lean on what we know. So for both of the census count and getting out the vote, we lean on relational organizing, which is door knocking, door-to-door canvassing, getting to know the people in the community. And none of that was possible in a COVID environment. So we had to flip pretty quickly to an online meeting structure. Our census campaign, we leaned much more heavily on paid advertising, and we also stood up PSAs. But that doesn't answer the question of, especially for the census, the historically undercounted communities are also those that don't have good broadband access. So it was much more difficult, and I don't think that we've closed the loop on how to access those communities in a pandemic when you are relegated to a screen or utilizing technology for something as acute as a census count. And GOTV, we also had to do the same thing. We did a lot of pivoting, but we leaned on relationships. So if I know someone and I'm trying to encourage them to vote, I'm going to text 5 people that I know, for example. So again, we took relational organizing and we tried to make it something that was happening behind a screen. And we don't know, it was a lot of things happened and the election had very high turnout. Some of it may be the way that we organized and some of it may be some other things. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Elana. So we only have like 2 minutes left. If you can go back on the slide, please. We want to thank all the speakers and all of you for participating in this meeting, and remind you to please complete the Claro survey we have just shared in the chat to learn more about the organizations that presented today. I hope you had a chance to scan the QR codes that were shown before. Oh, they're there again. If you have a chance, please scan those codes and also to stay connected with Claro. Please join our LinkedIn page to stay up to date on any upcoming events, or if you would like to collaborate with us. Also, if you can go to the next slide, please. If you are interested in, if you're interested in attending other diversity, equity, and inclusion SIGs happening today, be sure to add them to your agenda. And thanks again for being here. Here are the other DE&I and racial justice SIGs happening today. And thanks for coming. Have a nice
Thank you,
day.
everyone. Thank you to all our presenters. We hope you enjoyed it.